Hello, this is Anthony Watt. I am a reporter with the Quad City Times, the Moline Dispatch, and the Rock Island Argus. I am here with Eastern Iowa Community College's Professor Brian Hilton, and we are going to be discussing the events of January 6th at the U.S. Capitol. So tell us a little bit about yourself, sir. What do you teach at the college, and give us some of your credentials.
Well, my name is Brian Hilton. I have a PhD in American history that I received from Texas A&M University back in 2012. And for the last 8 years, I've been teaching courses in American history, mostly at Eastern Iowa Community Colleges here at the Belmont campus in Bettendorf. But I've also taught courses on African-American history, Western civilization, things of that nature. And I'm also part of our honors program here at Scott Community College, where I've taught classes on the U.S. Constitution. A couple of years ago, I taught a course on the year 1968, which is appropriate for our conversations here, given the political, social, cultural tumult of that year. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, all right. So let's go ahead and jump into it then. What was your impression of yesterday's events at the Capitol building?
Well, if I could answer that with a bit of a personal tangent here, I actually, as part of the honors program at Scott Community College, I actually lead groups of students to Washington, D.C. We usually go over spring break. We stay there for about 5 days or so, and it's an opportunity for us to give our students some firsthand exposure to what happens behind the scenes. And we take tours of buildings, and we meet with our legislators and other officials in our government. And so viewing what happened yesterday was particularly significant for me on a personal level, because I had been there. When I saw people, when I saw the guy in the image dangling from the balcony in the Senate chamber, I was on that balcony. When I saw people wandering through Statuary Hall, we were in that room. And so it was particularly shocking on that score. The only similar experience I think I had was about a month or two after 9/11, when I had some photos developed and from our summer trip, and there we were on top of the World Trade Center after the towers had fallen. And so it's for those of us who have actually been to Washington and seen the Capitol and taken those tours, it's particularly disturbing to think of what had happened yesterday.
Okay, all right. And what do you think what happened yesterday says about the state of the American political system?
From a historical standpoint, and there have been lots of things mentioned about the War of 1812 and the last time that the Capitol building had been penetrated when the British Army was there. I'm going to tackle this in a slightly different way that perhaps people aren't really talking much about or thinking much about. And for me, there's a couple of things that came to mind. And the first thing is that it seems to me that one of the key things that we're seeing here is a totally normal process that happens in almost any social movement that you're going to find in American history, where things become radicalized. They might start benign, they might even be rooted in real issues. But what inevitably happens in almost all of these cases is you have legitimate concerns that are raised at some level, whether it's the grassroots or the political system. They're looking at certain issues that they are concerned about. It works its way through a normal process, but then at some point, it becomes radicalized, and there emerges in these movements a great dissatisfaction And there's lots of moving parts to this. There's lots of things that can cause that. But inevitably, these things become radicalized and violent and out of control. And this happens regardless of what movement you're talking about, conservative or liberal or whatever. And I think what we're seeing now is the logical sequence of events whereby these concerns have become radicalized. For me, this really, begins a long time ago with the notion, particularly among conservatives, that that perhaps because of demographic trends, because of political trends, the American, there's almost a perception that the American electorate is moving in a certain direction, an inexorable direction. And so we will reach a point where perhaps we can't accomplish what we want to accomplish in the normal legislative process. And so what we have seen, it seems to me, over the last 10, 15 years or so, is an increasing reliance, particularly on the conservative side, for judges. That if we can't block progressive legislation, because we can't successfully, stem this progressive tide, that we're going to increasingly rely on the judiciary to block those things, because we can't trust the democratic process to produce the results that we would prefer. And that's part of our system. That's how our system is designed, right? We have different branches of government that do their own thing. But it seems to me that what's happened is that idea that our system, is going to produce these terrible results or these results that we don't prefer or whatever, or perceive as to be dangerous to who we are or how our system operates, that idea, which got out into the public and became not just a political thing, but also a cultural thing, has started to become radicalized. And again, with many social movements and cultural movements in the past, that has resulted in violence. And there does come a point in all of these movements where people realize the idea has gotten out of control, or at least the people who believe in the idea have gotten out of control. And I think that's where we are right now. And if that idea has merit, if that interpretation of what's happening has merit, then it's a fairly straight line to kind of figure out what's going to happen next. If history is to be believed here, then what we will see is a correction, that people will start to realize that this movement is out of control, and we will have a correction. We will have a backlash against that, and then at some point in the future, maybe 10, 20 years, or who knows, things will start to balance out again, until we have the next movement that becomes radicalized or whatever. So that's kind of what I see we are in this moment.
All right, so let's drill down on this a little bit. Talk a little bit about, walk us through that process with this specific movement, if you can, as far as you had kind of an ABC progression there. So talk a little bit about the legitimate concerns and then kind of that step towards radicalism. And to clarify, you think that we're at a point where we're at a crossroads point with this particular situation where people are going to be like, either this was too far or what do we do now? And so let's kind of use, if you could give me a couple of brief specific examples about that process in this particular case, and then we can go from there.
Well, sure. Well, the historical analogy, and again, there are countless historical analogies, but let's just go to the liberal side. The big story from the late 1960s was, and there are comparisons here. Well, let me drill down. Okay. The core problem is populism. The core idea here is that the government has become out of touch, or no longer representative, or disdainful of the views of ordinary people. Okay. And when that happens, or when that perception emerges and takes over, interesting things start happening. So in the late 1960s, just to take the Democratic side for the moment, there was an effort. There was an effort on the part of young people who poured out in droves in 1968, believing, hoping desperately that their voices would have meaning, would have influence, would be able to change things. Thousands of them came from all over the country, and they were, for reasons we don't need to get into necessarily, but their hopes were crushed. What they perceived as the establishment ignored them, and this resulted in a lot of anger, a lot of frustration that spilled over into violence. One of the key events of 1968 was the violent protest at the Democratic National Convention, which was a response to the fact that the establishment seemed to be corrupt, seemed to lack any kind of consideration.
And you're referencing Chicago, correct? That was that the Chicago one?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm pulling history out of my head now all of a sudden. So we're talking about the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, when there was all that unrest around that event.
And so it became radicalized. When you lose faith that the system is listening to you, and it should, right? I mean, the notion is that our voices should matter. But when you lose faith in that, when you lose faith that our institutions are working as they are supposed to, then the alternative that you might often resort to is violence. Not even necessarily that it will work, but just that's your only outlet. That's the only thing that's left for you, essentially, is to express yourself in these violent ways. And again, we see that with with the civil rights movement. It was peaceful, they marched, but African Americans started to lose faith in the system, and so it became radicalized. And to move it into the current example, and again, there's a lot to dig through here, and perhaps there are some things that I might be, upon further contemplation here, might be missing. But it seems to me that the big story, or one of them anyway, of recent decades, again, is this conservative concern about where the country is going, and perhaps that it began with this idea, benign perhaps, that the judiciary is the last hope, perhaps, of conservatism to stem this tide, particularly after the Obama years, when we had the Affordable Care Act passed, and this concern that we simply cannot stop these things from happening unless we have control of the judiciary, unless we can have judges to shut down these things, unless we can have control of the Supreme Court. And that's not a terrible idea necessarily, because it works within the system. But when you start to plant the seed into people's heads that we can't rely on the system to do what we want, to do the right thing from
the whole, you mean the whole system?
Right. All right. When you reach that, when you plant that idea, and then it grows into not just something that politicians are saying, but now you have millions of people who are accepting that idea, and it grows, and then it radicalizes, and to the point where Joe Biden wins the election. And I'm really curious, I don't even know if it's possible to know this, but I'm really curious what the Democratic Senate victories the day before, what that may have contributed to this idea, again, that we can't trust our system, we can't trust Democrats who are, by one perspective, trying to transform or destroy or damage or whatever our system or our way of life, and we are losing, and it's taking over, and we can't trust, and that idea radicalizes, and it leads to a point where we can't trust the system. The system's not working like it's supposed to. Our voices are not seeming to matter. And that will result in violence, perhaps. Now, there's moving parts to that, and there is something to be said about President Trump and his involvement. I really don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole because a lot of people already have said lots about that, and I'm sure that your listeners or readers have already got an earful of how Trump may be culpable for a lot of the things that are happening, and that's a story that's probably going to play out for the next couple of weeks at least.
All right. So let's talk. So that's a bit of an explanation of how you see us getting to the point that we were at yesterday. And correct me if I was wrong in that summation. But so let's talk about what's next. What I'm debating how to best say it is just like there's going to be a transition of power in a couple weeks. So let's just narrow it down to, let's just get through the next couple weeks in this question. So what do you see happening next, and what maybe needs to happen next for that transition to occur basically, can we have a peaceful transition of power, and how do we get there?
Man, so many people have said so often over the past 5 years that, the weight of the office will change Donald Trump, that he will grow into the office. And honestly, there were moments when I actually felt bad for President Trump. And I remember very clearly, actually, it was, I forget the exact example, but it was really early in his first year, and he did something and the courts struck it down. And there was reporting about how that affected him. And he was kind of somber, I mean, this is a man who, this is not an exaggeration, is the emperor of his own little world, and had complete control over his company, his life, his circumstances, and is thrust into the situation where he truly was not in charge. He's the president, but he has constituents, he has special interests, he has Congress, he has the Supreme Court. And it was a really interesting moment where he was it seemed like he was reflecting on that. And I genuinely felt bad for him at that moment, because it seemed like it was starting to sink in. I can't just do anything I want. And I've always wondered psychologically how he felt about that moment and all the moments since. And it really has seemed that he's just fought back tooth and nail on that idea that there are limits and restrictions. And I honestly am at a loss to have any predictions about what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks. Because it seems like he's in that same situation right now where, the world is turning against him. Republicans are turning against him. He still has his loyal supporters, but again, if reporting is to be believed, his advisors are begging him to take more assertive steps, to do something to rein in the violence, to say something against the people who so passionately support him. And it's just so fascinating to see, because you honestly don't know what's going to happen. And I'm not even going to try to predict, honestly. I just can't do it.
That's fair. All right. One last question. How has misinformation and conspiracy theory, you think, affected what has occurred? As far as, because you talked about people having legitimate concerns. And then there's been a lot of stuff out there about how there's been a lot of misinformation and basically
Sure.
unfactual information being injected into the conversation. How has that affected our political climate, and how did it contribute to putting us where we were yesterday?
Well, it's been fairly central because people don't trust information. And this is going to sound a little bit elitist on my part, but because a lot of people do denounce experts and do denounce people who purport to be well informed and experts in their field. But this really is a product of the democratization of information. As soon as you have the internet, as soon as you have social media, there's just so much information out there, and there is no longer one source of truth, or for what that's worth anyway. So it's really hard to tell who is giving you correct information, who is not. And again, the closest analogy we have to this, and the news has been reporting on this, is Joe McCarthy. Is the threat of Soviet espionage in our society in the 1950s real? Yes.
What was it he said? I have 10 names or something like that.
Right,
He's always in that envelope. So
and that's where it became a problem. It wasn't that the KGB wasn't out there with agents in our society. It wasn't that the Soviet Union didn't want to, defeat us and change our way of life. The question was, is this the way to tackle it? Or are we blowing the whole thing out of proportion? Are we violating people's rights in the process of, this intense hunt for these communists? Is the threat as bad as they are making it out to be? And the concern with Joe McCarthy was that, in large part because he was interested in his own personal power, in large part because he was interested in his own influence over our government and such, that the cause became warped and twisted and corrupted. It became more about McCarthy and his power than about the Cold War and the struggle against our real adversaries. So to put that into context today, what we've been hearing from members of Congress, at least some of them, is not necessarily that we want to overturn the election, but we want to address what we perceive to be as real issues in our elections. And there are irregularities, and that varies from state to state, of course. Not that they are serious enough to jeopardize the legitimacy of the entire election, but they exist. I think we can all agree that they exist to some extent. And what they were calling for, at least some of them, was a commission to investigate that. They said, and that's why they've been criticized a little bit as a political stunt. But they said, we don't want to overturn the election. We just want a commission to investigate these irregularities. Now, if we take that at face value, sure, but other people don't. Other people take that, and again, they've already been primed to believe that the threat is real and dire, in the same way that the American people, when Joe McCarthy first gained prominence, were already primed to believe that the threat was real and dire. And so, good intentions aside, this is what happens, and that's why you have to be very careful with how you present ideas. You have to be aware of what people are hearing and what people are already primed to believe. And again, I don't want to get too far into the personal motivations of Donald J. Trump. There have been lots of accusations about what he is trying to do and what he is or is not aware of. And again, there's lots of analysis about that from other people, and so I'll leave that to them. But it's important. It's important to emphasize and not allow people to misinterpret what you're saying. You know, as long as your intentions are good, right? That when you say there are irregularities, it's very important that people, you know, don't exaggerate that in their own minds and take irregularities to the conclusion that our system is fundamentally corrupt and anti-democratic. And I think
and for this conversation itself, when you discuss irregularities, what are you meaning here? Are you talking like stuff that we've seen before over the years? Like there is a certain level of
Sure.
When you talk about that for this exact reason, to make sure that people don't misunderstand what you mean.
Sure.
When you talk about irregularities and what they were discussing, what are you meaning? Define that a little bit more clearly for me.
Sure. And again, there have been lots of accusations out there about, well, set aside the specific examples. Everyone will admit that no election is perfect. It's broadly accepted that in every election there are going to be issues. Even the Georgia election supervisor just the other day was reporting on the Senate runoff elections, and he said, yeah, we had a problem. We had an issue where some of the vote talliers did something which, you know, was not exactly in the spirit of how he wanted to run things. We worked out a deal, we corrected that. So every election is going to have issues. When the problem emerges, however, the problem emerges when you perceive a pattern and you apply nefarious intent, right? So instead of acknowledging every election has problems and sometimes people do things that they shouldn't, but we correct, we have process for that. When you start to view that as a nefarious pattern, you know, that's when it starts to become a problem. It's no longer an isolated incident. Now it's become a conspiracy to undermine democracy, to undermine our elections. And that's how it has been cast by certain people, not as the normal hiccups, you know, and clearly there are, you know, problems, and I'm not a specialist in elections, but, you know, if you hear people talk about certain voting districts, whether it's Democratic or conservative, they will highlight, right? They will highlight, yes, that area has problems that they need to work on. Of course, the most famous is the hanging chads from Florida.
I remember the hanging chads.
Yeah, the hanging chads.
So, yeah.
So, but it's when you view that nefarious intent, when you view it as concerted strategy or conspiracy, that's when it starts to become a problem. And so I suspect that's what people hear. It's not what people are saying. Well, it's what Donald Trump is saying, but it's when you look at other members of Congress, other politicians who say similar things, they'll say we have irregularities. But people hear and they're primed to believe, perhaps, conspiracy. And again, it contributes to that process of radicalization where we can no longer do things, we can no longer trust the normal process. And it's a very uncomfortable feeling when the institutions that we have relied upon, when we feel like we cannot rely upon them anymore. And again, the only outlet that remains is violence, and it's very unfortunate when anything reaches that point.
All right, and I feel like I need to sum up here. Based off of what you observed, are we legitimately to that point? Is the system still working, or are there? You see what I'm getting at? Is this just like there is concerns that the system is broken? Do you believe that the system is at this point, or is it still functioning as it's supposed to?
The system is still functioning as it is supposed to, even during the Trump administration. And this actually brings up a really interesting historical analogy. There was actually a concern way back when the country was first founded. It was when Thomas Jefferson was elected president, and Jefferson's coalition was split. between two camps. One camp believed that the problem, because his predecessors had kind of gotten out of control with violating civil liberties and doing really kind of dictatorial kinds of things. And part of Thomas Jefferson's coalition was of the view that the problem was the Constitution, that it gave too much power to elected officials to run amok. But the other part of his coalition said, the Constitution is not the problem. The problem is the people who have been elected, who are running that government. And I think that one of the things that the Trump years or the Trump era has perhaps shown us is that is perhaps true. That, and we've heard various commentators say our Constitution has held. It has kept things relatively, in order. Our system has not fallen apart. We will maintain, we will overcome. But ultimately, our system doesn't work at either the political level or the social level unless people believe in it, unless people have respect for it. And I think when the history books are written, that's the big story that will come out of this, was that we had people in office, we had people running the government who essentially had lost faith in our constitutional order. And we heard them talk about praising the Constitution, defending the Constitution, and clearly there are some things that need to be looked at and maybe hashed out. The biggest constitutional issue recently was who has authority to establish election procedures, state legislatures versus governors and state Supreme Courts. And that's kind of messy, and I can kind of see what they're talking about there. But when you lose faith in the institutions, that's when things fall apart. So I think that is correctable. I think it has been corrected. And I think if I had to guess, historians really don't like to get into the guessing game about the future.
That's fair.
but if I had to guess, what I would say is, I suspect we're going to have a relatively nice 4 years. We might have policies that people don't like. We'll have some mean rhetoric going back and forth, but I suspect people might start to appreciate certain things. The normality, getting back into some kind of respectable mode of operations. And we've been through this before. I remember, I don't remember, I wasn't born then, but back in the 70s when the CIA's reputation was in tatters, they found somebody respectable, who was trusted, who was capable. They brought him in to reform the reputation of the CIA and to rebuild the public's trust. And that man's name was George Herbert Walker Bush. And he did a phenomenal job. And so I suspect we're going to see at least an effort to repeat that in the next 4 years. People have already been talking about Merrick Garland being above partisan politics, and as the Attorney General, perhaps bringing some sense of trust back to that body. They're all establishment. That's the other big story about Biden's cabinet picks is most of their establishment. Janet Yellen, not Janet Yellen.
They're comfortable picks, basically.
I forget the woman he picked to be Secretary of the Treasury. Was it Janet Yellen?
I don't remember either.
Just broadly respected people. They are establishment, but I suspect that will begin a process of trying to restore some kind of trust and faith in our institutions, and we'll see how that plays out. And even conservative commentators have noted that. Chris Wallace from Fox News, he said he said this weeks ago. He said this is the big takeaway. This is a moderate cabinet. This is a moderate group of leaders. And so we'll see how that plays out.
So it's really more about the reputation of the system than the function of the system itself at this point. Is that a fair summation?
I think the
Okay.
system
All right.
has. I think the system has functioned. I remember people asking me before 2016 or during 2016. They were concerned about what Trump might do, and I remember at that time I said, well, there's a difference between what he says he wants to do and what our system will allow him to do, and that's held mostly true. And it will hold mostly true for the Biden administration as well, I suspect. So I think our system is okay. Again, the boundaries of our constitutional order have held, and it's simply a matter of restoring the faith in that system. And if it can survive, the Trump years, we're going to be okay. Just like we survived McCarthy and all these other eras of tumult and change. So I have faith in the future.
Okay. All right. I think that will do. And I appreciate you taking the time with us. And, Happy New Year. So, all right. Have a good day. Thank you.
Okay.